This move opens diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, immediately fighting for central control and preparing for rapid development. This classic response immediately contests the center, opening lines for development and setting the stage for many well-established opening systems like the Italian game or the Ruy Lopez. This move, developing the knight to f3, immediately attacks black's central pawn on e5, forcing black to defend it and dictating the early direction of the game, often leading into well-established opening systems like the Ruy Lopez or Italian game. This move, 2, nc6, defends the pawn on e5 and develops a knight toward the center, adhering to opening principles and leading into a vast array of common and well-established opening systems like the Ruy Lopez or the Italian game. This move initiates the Ruy Lopez, a highly respected opening that immediately puts pressure on black's knight and indirectly on the e5 pawn, often leading to complex positional maneuvering. This move, a6, directly challenges white's bishop, forcing a decision on its placement and often leading to the Ruy Lopez opening, where black aims to clarify the central pawn structure and potentially gain space on the queenside. The retreat to a4 maintains the pressure on black's center and avoids immediate simplification. After 3, a6. This move, nf6, follows classical opening principles by developing a knight towards the center and attacking white's advanced e4 pawn, preparing to castle and further contesting central control in the Ruy Lopez opening. Castling kingside solidifies the king's safety and prepares to connect the rooks, a fundamental principle in the opening of this Ruy Lopez variation. This move logically develops the bishop to a good square, preparing for castling while simultaneously defending the e5 pawn and maintaining central control. This move repositions the rook to a central file, supporting the central pawn advance and preparing to potentially challenge black's control of the d-file, a common theme in the Ruy Lopez. Black boldly expands on the queenside with 6, b5, forcing white's bishop to retreat and preparing to gain space and initiative in this variation of the Ruy Lopez. The bishop retreats to the familiar b3 square, maintaining its influence on the long diagonal and preparing to support a potential d4 pawn advance. This move solidifies black's pawn center and prepares to develop the queen's bishop, reinforcing the pawn chain that was established by b5. This move reinforces the d4 pawn advance, creating a solid central pawn chain and preparing to develop the queenside bishop. This move strategically challenges white's well-placed bishop on b3, aiming to either trade it off or force it to retreat, thereby improving black's piece activity and control over the d4 square. This retreat of the bishop to c2 aims to reposition it to a more active diagonal, preparing for potential kingside play and supporting a central pawn push later. Black challenges white's spatial advantage in the center and on the queenside by expanding on the queenside and preparing to develop their queenside knight to a more active square. This central pawn thrust aims to open lines for white's pieces and challenge black's control of the d5 square, a common theme in the Ruy Lopez as the game transitions towards the middle game. This move, 10, qc7, prepares to reinforce the c5 pawn and supports the potential advance of the b pawn, while also preparing to potentially challenge white's central pawn on d4. This move prepares to reinforce the center and potentially develop the knight to a more active square, often f1 or g3, supporting white's central pawn thrust. This move develops the bishop actively to a challenging square, potentially pinning the knight and creating future attacking opportunities on the kingside. This move aggressively stakes a claim in the center, aiming to restrict black's pieces, particularly the knight on a5, and potentially prepare a kingside attack by closing the central pawn structure. This move aggressively challenges white's pawn center and prepares to liberate black's kingside. But it weakens the dark squares around the king and may lead to tactical complications if not supported carefully. This knight maneuver aims to redeploy to a more active square, likely f3, to contest the center and support potential king's side expansion, while also preparing to support a subsequent c4 advance. This move prepares to expand on the kingside by potentially creating a passed pawn or opening lines for the g-pawn, aiming to disrupt white's pawn center and create attacking chances. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to support a kingside attack while potentially contesting control of the central squares. This move, 14, road 8, repositions the rook to the d-file, potentially preparing for a central pawn break with d5 or reinforcing the defense of the d6 pawn, while also clearing the e8 square for a potential piece maneuver. This pawn advance challenges black's queenside pawn majority, aiming to disrupt their structure and potentially open lines for white's pieces. This move aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and gain queenside space, though it weakens the c4 square for black and allows white to potentially open the b-file for their rook. This pawn capture on b4 opens the c-file, creating dynamic imbalances and offering white the initiative to exploit the now exposed queenside. This capture opens the c-file for white's rook and continues black's pawn expansion on the queenside, creating complex pawn structures and tactical possibilities. This move repositions the bishop from the active c2 square to d3, aiming to control the long diagonal and prepare for potential kingside pawn advances or to support a central break. The bishop retreats to c8, a somewhat passive square, but one that maintains the pawn structure on the queenside and prepares for potential kingside expansion or regrouping. This move by white repositions the bishop to an active diagonal where it controls important central squares and supports potential advances in the center or on the queenside. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to challenge white's control of the center and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside. rc1 establishes control over the open c-file, preparing to challenge black's queen and potentially exploit weaknesses on the queenside that arose from the pawn structure exchanges. This move repositions the queen from an active but potentially vulnerable square to a safer one, while preparing to reinforce the queenside and possibly challenge white's control of the c-file. Developing the bishop to d2 aims to protect the c3 pawn and prepare for potential further queenside play, while also offering a retreat square if necessary. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the weakened d6 pawn and potentially supporting a kingside pawn advance or preparing to contest the b-file. This move prepares to support the advance of the f-pawn, aiming to create attacking chances on the kingside while also potentially freeing the rook on e1. The knight's aggressive foray to b3 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially fork the king and rook if white isn't careful. This move, rc6, aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and control the important c-file by creating tactical threats against the queen and potentially the b4 pawn. Black seeks to exploit the open a-file for their queen, challenging white's rook and simultaneously preparing for potential advances on the queenside. This move sacrifices a pawn to break black's coordination and gain a tempo, disrupting their queenside development and opening lines for white's attack after black captures the bishop. Black develops the bishop to a more active square, defending the b4 pawn and preparing to challenge white's control of the c-file. The move recaptures the sacrificed pawn, aiming to simplify the position and exploit the open nature of the c-file with the rook now supported by the bishop. This exchange sacrifices the bishop pair for material to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines towards the king. This recapture on c6 is a critical moment, forcing the black king into the open and initiating a decisive tactical sequence after the devastating knight sacrifice that cleared the way. With white having just delivered a check and captured a piece, black's king must immediately seek safety, making the move to f8 a defensive necessity, though it leaves the king somewhat exposed on the open file. This move prepares to centralize the queen, eyeing the weak squares around black's king while simultaneously defending the pawn on c3, a crucial defensive point. This move is a critical decision, sacrificing the knight on f3 to break the kingside attacking potential and simplifying the position. After the previous exchanges, aiming to exploit the open c-file, this move resolves the tension on the d2 square, allowing white to recapture the knight and begin preparing for a rook lift to the 4th rank, potentially attacking black's king or supporting a queenside pawn advance. The rook on c6 is now targeted, and bringing the queen to a7 seeks to defend the rook and potentially counterattack along the a-file or support a subsequent rc8 maneuver. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting an attack on black's kingside or preparing to contest open files on the queenside. The move h5 is a bold attempt to dislodge white's knight and create attacking potential on the kingside, although it weakens black's king's position and requires careful calculation to avoid counterplay. The knight's advance to f5 aims to disrupt black's king's safety and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the king after the pawn push on g5. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest white's control of the d5 square and potentially support an attack on the king's side. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control the central squares and potentially create attacking opportunities on the king's side. This move aims to regroup the queen, connect the rooks on the back rank, and potentially prepare for further activity on the queenside or a central pawn break. This move reinforces the d4 pawn and prepares to advance the b-pawn, aiming to gain space on the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn. This knight's retreat to h6 aims to reinforce the kingside pawn chain and prepare for potential pawn advances or defensive maneuvers, while also clearing the f5 square for other pieces. This exchange removes a highly active defender of the black kingside and aims to exploit the weakened pawn structure, opening lines for white's pieces. The rook now becomes active on the h-file, aiming to support the kingside pawn advance and potentially participate in attacking play on white's castled king. This move activates the queen, intending to potentially support a kingside pawn push and prepare for future operations on the d-file or along the central squares. This move prepares to challenge the open c-file, aiming to increase pressure on white's king and potentially create counterplay for black's rook. This rook move activates the piece onto the open c-file, creating pressure against black's queenside and potentially supporting a future advance or maneuver. On the queenside, this move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure white's queenside pawns and potentially support a future kingside pawn advance. This exchange of queens simplifies the position, and white aims to leverage their superior pawn structure in the active rook on the c-file in the ensuing endgame. The exchange of queens simplifies the position, and white's remaining pieces, particularly the knight on c4, are well placed to exert pressure on black's vulnerable kingside. This exchange aims to exploit the weakened light squares on black's kingside after the material has been exchanged, potentially leading to a decisive advantage by attacking the king. The king abandons the exposed central files after the exchange of queens, seeking refuge on a safer square, and preparing to potentially support the remaining pawns. The capture on c5 wins a pawn and opens lines for white's remaining rook to potentially infiltrate black's weakened position, aiming to exploit the exposed king. Black's desperate attempt to create counterplay by opening lines with f5 is unlikely to succeed, given white's well-placed pieces and kingside pawn majority, which will soon become a dangerous passed pawn. The rook on c4 aims to exploit the weakened kingside by potentially swinging to the g4 square to attack the pinned knight and create further threats against the black king. This move brings the bishop to a more active square, directly challenging white's control of the d4 square and preparing to potentially support pawn advances on the queenside. This move, repositioning the bishop to a more active diagonal, allows it to control key central squares and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside. This exchange of queens simplifies the position considerably, and while black has traded a rook for a bishop and pawn, white's central pawn majority and more active king will likely pose significant problems in the ensuing endgame. This knight capture simplifies the position by trading off black's active knight, creating an isolated pawn on f5 for black and opening lines for white's rooks. The move 40, bc7 repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, now eyeing the weakened light squares around white's king and offering potential support for black's remaining pawns. With the immediate pawn tension resolved and exchanges having occurred, white c5 advances, aiming to restrict black's pieces and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside by opening lines. The bishop retreats to b8 to escape the attack of the pawn and to eye the c7 pawn, anticipating white's desire to create a passed pawn with the remaining pieces. This knight move repositions the piece to potentially control central squares and support pawn advances, while also preparing to contest the f5 square. This move is an attempt to centralize the rook and prepare for further activity on the kingside, potentially supporting a kingside pawn advance or defending the king. This move, (nx_f5+), is a decisive tactical blow, aiming to win material by forking the black king and the bishop on b8, while simultaneously opening lines for white's remaining pieces. The king must prioritize safety and centralization in the endgame, moving to the center to participate in defending the remaining pawns. This move is a powerful tactical blow, exploiting the pinned king and forcing a capture that opens the e-file for the rook and creates a dangerous passed pawn. With the opponent's king exposed after the exchange of pieces, the logical continuation is to use the active rook and passed pawn to escort the king towards a safer square, regrouping for the next phase of the endgame. This pawn advance leverages the newly created open file and the powerful outpost on f5 to force a favorable pawn endgame by promoting the e-pawn. This move is a forced recapture that allows white to promote their passed pawn, decisively ending the game as black lacks sufficient resources to stop the promotion. This move is a strong simplification, leading to an endgame where white's passed pawn on the 7th rank is a significant advantage, aiming to promote it for a decisive material gain. This move signifies the end of the tactical fireworks, transitioning into a pawn-up endgame where white aims to consolidate their advantage. This move solidifies the pawn structure and prepares to develop the king to a more active square. The rook pawn on h7 needs support to advance and create passed pawns. And the bishop's repositioning aims to defend it and control key squares in the endgame. This move is a simple king repositioning maneuver, moving the king to a safer square on g2 to prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside or to avoid any unforeseen tactical threats. The move 48, Kd6 is a crucial step to centralize the king, aiming to support the remaining pawns and defend against white's active pieces in the endgame. The move b8 repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control key squares and support potential pawn pushes while also preparing to connect the rooks. This pawn push aims to create counterplay on the kingside and potentially open lines for the rook. But it weakens the kingside pawn structure and could be met with aggressive central play. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, preparing to support the advance of the kingside pawns and potentially contest the diagonal previously controlled by black's bishop. The king steps into the center to support the passed pawn and prepare for future pawn advances in this endgame. With the pawn structure simplified and the material even, white's king needs to become active to support its remaining forces and potentially create threats. In the endgame, the bishop repositions to a more active diagonal, aiming to control key squares and potentially support an advance of the g-pawn or provide defense. If the king comes closer, king activation is paramount in the endgame. This move brings the monarch closer to the center to support the pawn push. This move develops black's pawn to g3, creating an open file for the rook and aiming to restrict white's bishop on b5, while simultaneously preparing to recapture with the rook. The pawn structure has been simplified, and this move aims to activate the remaining pieces by creating a more fluid central pawn presence and opening lines for the king's protection. The move prepares to centralize the king by heading towards the e5 square, aiming to activate it and support the remaining pawn structure against white's potentially dangerous passed pawn. The bishop on e6 now controls the key d7 square and reinforces the pawn chain, aiming to restrict black's king and potentially support a kingside pawn advance. The king continues its journey towards the center, aiming to become an active participant in the endgame and support its remaining pawn. The move d6 aims to solidify white's central pawn mass and create a passed pawn, while also potentially opening lines for the bishop on b5 to attack black's kingside. The king is forced to retreat to a more passive square, allowing white's advanced pawn to become a significant threat. The bishop repositions to a more active square, aiming to support the pawn push and potentially control the central squares. The bishop repositions to b6, offering to trade itself for white's remaining knight, which would simplify the position into a more favorable endgame for black due to white's somewhat exposed king. This move activates the passed d-pawn, aiming to escort it forward to create serious counterplay or force concessions from black. This move prepares to develop the bishop to a more active square, potentially challenging white's advanced pawn or supporting a pawn break. This move is about activating white's king by bringing it closer to the center to support the passed pawns. This pawn capture opens the g-file for black's rook, creating immediate attacking possibilities against white's king and preparing for further pawn advances. This capture opens the g-file for the rook, creating immediate threats against the black king and requiring careful defensive maneuvering. This move aims to centralize the bishop and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, but it overlooks the immediate threat of white's passed pawn advancing to h7. This move creates a passed pawn on the kingside, aiming to advance it and create a decisive threat that black cannot ignore. The move aims to create a passed pawn on the h-file, a common strategic goal in endgames where pawn races become decisive. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control key diagonals and support the central pawn push that is critical for queenside space advantage.